"You're illiterate." The words cut through the air like a knife as Sheikh Faisal Al Rahman stood on the pristine Dubai street, his white kandura and traditional gutra immaculate in the afternoon sun, his face contorted with rage as he pointed aggressively at the black man standing beside the gleaming blue Rolls Royce. David Carter stood in his professional chauffeur uniform, a perfectly tailored pinstripe suit that spoke to the luxury service he provided, his posture dignified and composed despite being publicly berated on a busy street where other drivers and pedestrians were beginning to notice the confrontation. But there was something in David's calm expression, a subtle intelligence in his eyes, a quiet confidence that didn't match being called illiterate by a man who had spent the last 3 hours discussing confidential business matters in the back seat, while assuming his driver was too uneducated to understand anything of importance. Sheikh Faisal's finger jabbed toward David accusingly, his voice rising as he blamed him for taking a wrong turn, for not understanding simple directions, for being too stupid to follow basic instructions about which building to stop at. Behind them, the Rolls Royce sat with its door still open, and visible through the opening was Sheikh Faisal's briefcase, with important documents partially visible, papers he had been reviewing during the drive, while making phone calls about deals worth millions. What happened in the next 72 hours would cost Sheikh Faisal everything he had been working to build, destroy a merger he had spent 2 years negotiating, and reveal that the driver he had just called illiterate and fired in front of witnesses had overheard every single word of the confidential conversations about insider trading and market manipulation that Sheikh Faisal had carelessly conducted in the back seat, and that this supposedly uneducated driver possessed both the knowledge to understand what he had heard and the moral courage to ensure the right people learned about the illegal activities being planned. David Carter had been working as a private chauffeur in Dubai for 11 months, driving for wealthy clients who needed reliable, discreet transportation between meetings, events, and personal appointments. He had built a solid reputation in the luxury driver services sector, known for his professionalism, his excellent knowledge of the city, and his absolute discretion about client conversations and activities. To most of his clients, he was simply the driver, a service provider whose job was to navigate traffic and open doors, whose personal story and background were never discussed because drivers weren't important enough to warrant curiosity beyond their ability to provide reliable transportation. But David carried himself with a bearing and vocabulary that occasionally made observant people look twice. The way he handled himself with complete confidence in any situation, from 5-star hotels to exclusive business districts. The way he seemed to understand complex business discussions that happened in his back seat, occasionally making subtle facial expressions that suggested comprehension rather than the blank incomprehension wealthy passengers expected from hired help. The way he read financial newspapers and business journals during his breaks between clients, making notes in margins as if studying rather than just passing time. A few regular clients had noticed these things and wondered briefly about their driver, who seemed somehow different, but in the world of luxury services, where class boundaries were rigidly maintained, such observations were quickly forgotten. Sheikh Faisal Al Rahman was 43, a self-made millionaire who had built his wealth through aggressive real estate investments and financial trading. He was known in business circles for pushing ethical boundaries, for deals that seemed to work out suspiciously well for him, for having information about market movements that suggested either incredible luck or access to insider knowledge. He treated service workers with casual contempt, viewing drivers, housekeepers, restaurant staff, and anyone in a service role as essentially invisible, certainly not intelligent enough to understand the sophisticated business he conducted. He had employed David's services through a luxury driver agency for 3 months, using him regularly for transportation to business meetings because David was always on time, knew the city well, and most importantly, seemed completely oblivious to the conversations Sheikh Faisal conducted in the back seat. Over those 3 months, David had driven Sheikh Faisal to dozens of meetings, had spent hundreds of hours listening to phone calls and backseat discussions about business deals, market strategies, and financial maneuvers, and David had heard things that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Conversations about a pending merger where Sheikh Faisal clearly had insider information from someone on the board of the target company. Phone calls discussing plans to manipulate stock prices through coordinated buying and selling with other investors. detailed discussions of how to structure deals to avoid regulatory oversight and hide beneficial ownership. It was sophisticated financial crime, discussed openly in the back seat of a Rolls Royce by a man who assumed his driver was too uneducated to understand terms like securities fraud, market manipulation, and insider trading. The explosion that destroyed everything happened after a particularly important meeting where Sheikh Faisal had finalized details of a major merger in the technology sector. He was euphoric, already counting the millions he would make from the insider information he possessed about the deal before it became public. He had been on the phone with his co-conspirators, reviewing their strategy for maximizing profits, when David had taken what he thought was the correct turn toward Sheikh Faisal's next destination based on the address he had been given. But Sheikh Faisal, distracted by his phone call and not paying attention to where they were going, suddenly realized they were approaching from a different direction than usual, and exploded with rage. He screamed at David to stop the car immediately, right in the middle of the street. He threw open the door and got out, pointing and yelling at David, who also stepped out professionally to understand what the problem was. "You're illiterate!" Sheikh Faisal shouted in English, making sure anyone nearby could hear and understand. "You can't even read a simple address correctly. You're too stupid to follow basic directions. How did someone as illiterate as you even get a driver's license? You're fired. Get away from my car." The words were designed to humiliate, to establish dominance, to remind David of his place in Sheikh Faisal's worldview. David stood calmly through the entire tirade, his face composed, his posture dignified, saying nothing in his own defense, because he had learned over years of service work that defending yourself to people like Sheikh Faisal only made things worse. When Sheikh Faisal finally dismissed him with a contemptuous wave, telling him to leave immediately, and that he would be calling the agency to ensure David never worked for anyone important again, David simply nodded respectfully, got back in the car long enough to retrieve his personal belongings from the driver's area, and walked away, while Sheikh Faisal called another driver service to come pick him up. But as David walked away from that Rolls Royce and that screaming millionaire, he was thinking about everything he had overheard over 3 months, all the illegal conversations he had documented in his memory, all the details about market manipulation and insider trading that Sheikh Faisal had discussed so freely in front of a driver he assumed was too illiterate to understand or care. And David made a decision that would change both their lives forever. What Sheikh Faisal didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn despite 3 months of regular service, was that David Carter wasn't a career chauffeur who had stumbled into luxury driver services. He was a former financial analyst with a master's degree in finance from London School of Economics, who had spent 8 years working for a major investment bank before walking away from that career for personal reasons related to the ethical compromises it required. He had become a driver specifically because it was honest work that let him live simply while he figured out his next move, but he had lost none of his sophisticated understanding of financial markets, securities law, and the mechanisms of financial crime. Every conversation Sheikh Faisal had conducted in the back seat, David had understood completely. Every illegal scheme discussed, David had recognized for exactly what it was. And every detail had been carefully noted and remembered by someone with the expertise to understand both the technical aspects and the legal implications. Within 6 hours of being fired and called illiterate on a public street, David had compiled a detailed memorandum documenting everything he had overheard over 3 months. Names, dates, specific schemes, the merger that was about to be announced, the insider information Sheikh Faisal possessed, the coordinated market manipulation being planned. Within 12 hours, he had contacted the Securities and Commodities Authority, the regulatory body that oversaw financial markets in the UAE, and requested a meeting to discuss potential securities fraud and market manipulation. Within 24 hours, he was sitting in their offices with senior investigators, walking them through a case that would become one of the largest insider trading prosecutions in Gulf financial history. The investigators were initially skeptical of a chauffeur making such serious accusations, but their skepticism evaporated quickly as David walked them through the technical details of the schemes with the fluency of someone who clearly understood sophisticated financial instruments and regulatory frameworks. When they asked about his background, and he explained his education and former career, they realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary witness. but rather with someone who had essentially been an undercover financial expert, documenting crimes from inside the vehicle where they were being planned. The evidence was largely testimonial, but David's credibility was strong. His memory for details was impressive, and most importantly, he could explain to investigators exactly where to look for corroborating evidence in trading records, phone records, and communications that would prove the conspiracy. Within 48 hours, the SCA had launched a formal investigation into Sheikh Faisal and his associates. Within 72 hours, just as the merger was about to be publicly announced, authorities moved to freeze Sheikh Faisal's trading accounts and search his offices, seizing computers and documents that would provide the corroborating evidence for everything David had reported. Sheikh Faisal was stunned when investigators arrived at his home, unable to comprehend how his insider trading scheme had been discovered, just days before it would have made him tens of millions in profit. The merger announcement was delayed as regulators investigated. His co-conspirators began turning on each other as the investigation expanded. His entire carefully constructed plan collapsed in spectacular fashion. It wasn't until investigators questioned him about his activities over the previous 3 months that Sheikh Faisal learned how he had been caught. They asked him about conversations in his car, about phone calls made during drives, about discussions with his co-conspirators that had been overheard by someone with the expertise to understand what they meant. Sheikh Faisal felt his blood turn cold as he realized what must have happened, as he understood with sickening clarity that the driver he had called illiterate, the man he had assumed was too uneducated to comprehend anything important, had understood every word and had provided authorities with a roadmap to his crimes. The investigators confirmed what Sheikh Faisal was beginning to understand. His former driver, David Carter, had turned out to be not a simple chauffeur, but a highly educated financial professional who had recognized securities fraud when he heard it, and had made the decision to report it despite knowing it would end his employment and potentially create complications in his own life. The irony was devastating. Sheikh Faisal had treated David as invisible and unimportant specifically because he assumed drivers were uneducated, and that assumption had led him to conduct criminal conversations freely in front of the one person who had both the expertise to understand them and the ethics to report them. The legal consequences were severe. Sheikh Faisal was charged with insider trading, market manipulation, and securities fraud. His assets were frozen, pending the outcome of the investigation. The evidence that investigators found corroborated everything David had reported, showing a pattern of illegal trading over several years that had netted Sheikh Faisal millions in illicit profits. His co-conspirators were also charged, and several of them accepted plea deals that required them to testify against Sheikh Faisal in exchange for reduced sentences. The trial became major news in Gulf business circles, both because of the amounts involved and because of the unusual way the crime had been discovered through testimony from a driver who turned out to be a financial expert. Sheikh Faisal was ultimately convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 8 years in prison, along with fines that exceeded $20 million. His business empire collapsed, his reputation was destroyed, and the story of how he was caught became a cautionary tale, told in 2 different ways to 2 different audiences, in business schools and ethics courses. It was taught as an example of how insider trading inevitably gets discovered, and how assuming that service workers are invisible and ignorant can lead to catastrophic exposure of criminal activity. In social justice and labor rights contexts, it was told as a story about how treating people with contempt based on their job or perceived education level can blind you to their actual capabilities and lead you to make devastating mistakes. For David Carter, the consequences were complex. He lost his chauffeur job, as he had known he would, but that hardly mattered given what followed. The SCA recognized his contribution to uncovering major financial fraud and provided him with a substantial reward from their whistleblower fund, money that gave him financial security for the first time in years. More importantly, his role in the case became known in financial regulatory circles, and he was offered a position as a consultant, helping regulatory authorities understand and investigate complex financial crimes. It was work that aligned with both his skills and his values, allowing him to use his financial expertise in service of preventing fraud rather than enabling it. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing so this channel can reach more people like you. Now, back to the story. He became an advocate for whistleblower protections and for recognizing that financial crimes are often observed by people in service positions who overhear conversations that criminals assume no one important is listening to. He worked with regulatory bodies to develop training programs that encouraged and protected people in positions like drivers, assistants, and household staff who might observe criminal activity and need safe channels to report it. And he spoke publicly about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect, not just because it was ethical, but because underestimating people based on their job or appearance could have serious consequences when those people turned out to have capabilities you never bothered to discover. Years later, when asked about the case that had made his name known in regulatory circles, David would note simply that Sheikh Faisal's downfall was entirely self-inflicted. If he had treated his driver with basic respect, he might never have needed the driver to know anything about finance. But by treating him with contempt, by calling him illiterate while conducting criminal conversations in his presence, Sheikh Faisal had made the fatal error of assuming that someone's job title or service role meant they couldn't possibly understand or act on what they observed. It was an assumption rooted in class prejudice and casual cruelty, and it had cost him everything, while ultimately serving justice by exposing crimes that harmed honest investors and corrupted financial markets.